Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Community Board 5. I'm Nick Athanale, the chair of the Committee on Public Safety, Quality of Life. I'll be presiding this evening. We've got two items on the agenda tonight. The first is a hearing by three committees. It will be a joint hearing by the Committee on Public Safety, Quality of Life, Transportation and Environment, Parks and Public Spaces. I'll be the chair of PSQL. EJ Kalifarsky and Sam Levy will be the chair and vice chair of Transportation and Environment. Craig Slutskin will be the vice chair of both PSQL and Parks and Public Spaces. If you are wondering why we're having, that was the first item. The second item is a matter just being heard by the PSQL committee on beverage to go rules. So if you'd like to stay on for both items, you're welcome to. The first item will be the joint meeting. The second item will just be PSQL. If you're wondering why we're doing a joint meeting, EJ Kalifarsky will explain that.
Sure, and let me know if there are any audio issues. The first item that we're going to hear about tonight, which I think it's probably too early to call it a proposal. It seems to be a concept that's making a lot of rounds among various organizations and our elected officials at this point. Tonight we're hearing from the New York City Hospitality Alliance. The proposal is somewhat unprecedented in regards to its nature. It's not the type of thing that comes before us frequently or very often at all. The idea of closing streets for outdoor dining with few examples, like maybe Stone Street down in the financial district, does not happen frequently in New York. So since it's quite unprecedented, and it is more or less a combination of these various committee authorities, T&E, which usually hears proposals for street closures, Parks, which usually hears proposals for curbside outdoor dining, and PSQL, which of course oversees the regulation and licensing of dining and liquor establishments in terms of not just their liquor license, but also their effect on the neighborhood, such as hours of operation and sound and protecting the community from those types of effects. The proposal that has been batted around and that we're likely going to hear is essentially a combination of the jurisdiction of those three committees. And so it seemed to make sense to hear it as a combined joint committee.
Thank you, EJ. So I will explain to the group how we're going to proceed with the joint meeting tonight. The way it works, we now have a quorum of all of the three committees participating. So we will then combine all of those three committees to one committee of the whole. If we take a vote tonight, it will be of the committee of the whole. If you are a board member on both Parks and PSQL, for example, you won't vote twice, once for each committee. You'll just vote once on the committee of the whole. We will invite Robert Bookman, who is counsel to the New York City Hospitality Alliance, to give a presentation. Typically, I allow committee members to ask questions and make comments in real time. And what that means is two things. One, for the committee members, if you have a question or a comment during the presentation portion, click the raise hand button and wait for me to recognize you. Robert, what that means for you is that if there's a question, I may interrupt you so that we can hear from a committee in real time. After the presentation portion, we'll have questions and comments from the committee generally. After that, I will open up the floor to questions and comments from the public. The way that will work, if you're a member of the public and you have a comment, I'll ask you to click the raise hand button. I'll recognize you. You will then be upgraded to a panelist so that we can all see you and we can interact with you as you make your comment. After your comment is finished, we'll set you back to an attendee, and you can continue listening to the presentation. After we hear from the public, I'll put the committee into what's called a business session. During the business session, no further input from the presenter or the public is appropriate unless requested by the chair. That's me. If the committee is going to take any action tonight, there will be a motion and a second on that motion. There will be a roll call vote of the committee, the single committee as a whole, and the vote of that committee will be our recommendation to the full board of Community Board 5, which meets sometime in 2 weeks. Please check the website for that schedule. I see one raised hand. Should we recognize Tim Tompkins? Tim, do you have a question?
Oh, no, it was just to be one of the people to give comments whenever it's appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, great. When I ask for that, we'll recognize you. Thanks. Okay, without further ado, I will introduce Robert Bookman, who we've invited here tonight to speak on behalf of the New York City Hospitality Alliance. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate the opportunity here. Vicky, I saw her screen up there before. It's good to see you again as well. My name is Rob Bookman. Many of you know me, as an representing applicants, but I'm also one of the founders of the New York City Hospitality Alliance. That organization is about 7 years old now. It represents about 2,000 different restaurant, bar, nightlife, hotel establishments throughout the city. We've been extraordinarily active in the last couple of months. You probably have seen our executive director, Andrew Rigi, on TV, and we are here to discuss what is going around now, as was said, an unprecedented idea for unprecedented times. Just briefly, a couple of minutes. The restaurant and bar industry has been particularly hard hit and decimated by COVID-19. There are fears that at least 25% of our neighborhood local establishments will not ever reopen. The fear is it could be as high as 50% by the end of the year. In the month of April, it was the hardest hit for loss of jobs of any sector in the city of New York. Over 85% of the people that work in restaurants and bars lost their jobs in 1 month. Yeah, staggering number. And the programs that you may have participated in, if you're a small business owner or you've read about, just weren't helpful for restaurants. They weren't designed for it. So the biggest one that you've probably read about is the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program. Doesn't work for restaurants because in order for the loan to be converted into a grant, and that's what small businesses need, they need grants, not more debt. You have to have all of your employees back by mid-June. We don't even believe that we're going to be open in New York City by the end of June, let alone anywhere near full capacity. So that program didn't work, and there are proposals in Washington now, if they can come to an agreement to change that. But that was the major program, and it didn't work. The other thing that people were relying on was the business interruption insurance, which is insurance that small businesses pay large premiums for. And it was a real gut punch when we found that every insurance company was denying coverage for COVID sometime, and that's an issue that's, lots of people are going to court. I believe in Times Square tonight, there's going to be a moment of where all the billboards go dark and a video is going to be played in support of small businesses and asking insurance companies to do the right thing. So I give that to you as a background for you to understand how desperate the times really are. In New York City, we are at least 4 or 5 weeks away at best, based on the governor's current 3 phases. Restaurants are in phase 3. So even if New York City gets into phase 1, let's say by this weekend or Monday, and it's a minimum 2 weeks per phase, we're still looking at the earliest in early July before restaurants would be able to open up indoors. And then we don't know what that's going to look like. Clearly, it's not going to be 100% capacity. and it hasn't been anywhere else where restaurants have opened up. And so we're thinking that it may not be full capacity this calendar year. So when you look at all of that, of course, we have no idea what consumer behavior is going to be like, whether they want to go back to restaurants indoors, whether they're going to have the money to do it. The unemployment is going to be lingering. So an idea that has been gaining a lot of steam, and we've been seeing it starting in Europe and in many other cities on the West Coast, and now in areas of New Jersey and Connecticut, is reimagining our outdoor space for an emergency period of time for this one season, to allow for outdoor eating and drinking where we haven't had it before. And there seems to be some science behind outdoor dining, if properly spaced, being safer than indoor dining. And municipalities, as I said, around the country are moving in that direction. So we have partnered, and the hope is to do that long before indoor dining. We partnered with Corey Johnson and the City Council about a week or so ago. There was a joint op-ed with Andrew and Corey. Since Corey was in charge, was really leading the charge on getting open streets to begin with. He's taken the lead on wanting to see if we can use some of these open streets or lanes of streets to allow for temporary dining. It's more of an idea now than a particular structure, and part of that was he asked us, and us being the Hospitality Alliance, we sent out a request and an online response survey to every community board in the city, every elected official in the city, every business improvement district, to seek your feedback. What do you think about the concept? What restrictions would you like to see if there was such a concept? Hourly restrictions, no music, things have come up in my conversations with other community boards. And do you have suggestions, since you know your neighborhoods best, for either an entire street that could be closed, a la Stone Street, which was mentioned before, or a lane of a street that could be closed? One side of the street perhaps, or of an avenue, or Park Avenue. Is there a lane that could be closed in an area where there's a lot of restaurants, and allow for contiguous restaurants, to use that space, so as to try to get some sense of business going again, to get some people employed again, and most importantly, to get some sort of sense of community back, because reimagining how we use our streets we think is critical, but we also think that there is no recovery for New York unless the hospitality industry is really at the center of that recovery. So that is the general idea that is going around, and why we're asking for feedback. There's no particular resolution, we have to ask you, to vote on, but we ultimately want yours and the other community boards' feedback on this. I got to say, so far, the community boards I've spoken to in Manhattan have been very positive. Lots of ideas, for streets. Closing an entire street is clearly difficult, in New York City. A lane here and there, is easier. There's one other piece of information to update you on is, so as this is moving very quickly, because speed is very important, we're trying to get something done long before July. And that's because, and if you look at your second item, your agenda, the reality is that it's becoming a Wild West out there with no lawful places to sit down and eat and drink outside. People are doing whatever they want to do, and it's creating a Wild West scenario, an enforcement nightmare. We don't need the police to be spending a lot of time on this, but unless we create a structure where people can do it lawfully, people are going to do it unlawfully. It's the same argument 25 years ago when I found the first nightlife association, and I would speak to, at that time, Mayor Giuliani, and I said, people are going to go out and dance late at night. Our options are twofold. We can either have safe license places for people to go out and dance and regulate with community board input on their licensing, or they're going to have unsafe places like the Happy Land. So it's a similar kind of thing. The warm weather is upon us. People have been in for 2.5 months. They want to get out. They want to socialize. We got to do it in a safe way. And to do it in a safe way, it needs to be a regulated way. So tomorrow there's going to be a press conference at 11 o'clock with Corey Johnson and ourselves. He is announcing the introduction of legislation tomorrow. It is a conversation starter, the legislation, it's to get the administration involved in a time frame. They're looking for a hearing date, but it's basically going to ask Department of Transportation, after consultation with community boards, restaurant groups, business improvement districts, block associations, to come up with locations where they believe it would be safe, from a bus perspective, from an emergency perspective, to do something like this, and for the Department of Health to come up with guidelines as far as table spacing, if there's going to be waiter and waitress service, does there have to be? If there is, what's that going to look like? And that's what, and this legislation is, is going to try to get that ball moving, and that's going to be introduced tomorrow. So other than that, happy to answer any questions.
I'm wondering if Lori H. has any more information on the press conference that she can provide. Since
yeah, I mean,
hi, Lori.
Hi. Well, Robert pretty much covered it all, but it is an introduction. I think that's important. It's a first draft. The speaker is definitely very interested in it, but he really is looking for feedback. So that is the reason I am very interested in being here tonight, because I want to hear your feedback. It does include DOT, DCA, and DOHMH. They each have a role to play in this. The bill also calls for expediting sidewalk cafe permits for obvious reasons. Yeah, tomorrow the press conference is at 11 a.m., like Robert said, and the stated meeting, they're going to be discussing at the stated meeting, but there could be a hearing as early as next week.
I would add that in speaking with council members, there's a lot of interest outside of Manhattan as well, where there aren't as many sidewalk cafes, but there's a desire to have some sort of structure, temporary, whether it's on the sidewalks or not. And like I said, this is just an intro. Speaker's office has been great. We've been throwing around ideas, the last few days, but there is part of it would be an expedited, one season only emergency sidewalk cafe permit for those locations where it's lawful under the zoning resolution to have a sidewalk cafe with the same rules and requirements as a sidewalk cafe, but a more expedited process as an idea. Because at the end of the day, we don't know, quite frankly, how many of these streets or lanes will actually, be able to come to fruition. New York is complicated.
Yeah, and I'll just add that as of now, the projected date for it to expire is October.
Right.
But all of that depends on, obviously, what's happening as far as the need for social distancing.
Got it. I see a few hands from the committee. EJ?
Thanks. So two high-level questions at this point. The first, you mentioned the desire for outdoor seating to become available before indoor seating becomes available, theoretically in July. Is that, and these questions could be for Lori H. or the Hospitality Alliance. Does that appear to be currently permitted by the phase 2 rules, or would the state's requirements need to change as well to even allow that?
All of this would be subject to the governor approving it. No municipality, no county could do any sort of opening without ultimately the governor's approval. We've obviously also spoken to the governor's people, and there's a certain amount, as you can imagine, between the city and the state, a certain chicken and the egg kind of approach. But the best feedback I've gotten from speaking with governor's people is we're not really getting into that unless, there's a municipality that comes to us and says we want to do it, and then we will look at it with the governor. Will look at it with his safety protocols. It may not be in a phase that's earlier than phase 3.
Okay.
Anything else, EJ?
Yeah, one other question. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of things like who's responsible for putting up barricades, who's responsible for taking down barricades, who's responsible for sanitation, who's responsible for bathrooms. You know, I'm sure there are or can be various answers to like all those questions. Are those things that, and maybe this is a question for Lori H., are those going to be addressed in the legislation, or is the anticipation that, say, DOT sets those rules somewhere down the road?
Well, as far as, if you're asking about the social distancing, and I don't know in terms of using bathrooms, but as far as the social distancing, that's DOH/MH will have the wherewithal to set those guidelines. And what was the rest of your question, EJ?
Like setting up, actually being responsible for closing off the street, protecting the street from cars, you know.
I mean, at this point, we assume it'll be DOT. But, you know, again, we want really, I think Robert and I both want to emphasize this is a first draft. So, I mean, we are looking at every way possible to help the restaurant industry. So this is one of the major ways that's being considered.
This is how I wrap my head around it. EJ, there's like 3 categories the way I see it. Well, 4, if you will. First is there are the 1,300 licensed sidewalk cafes that already exist in New York City. And whenever the go-ahead, you know, whenever the go-ahead is, whether it's phase 3 or earlier, they're ready to go. They're clearly going to have a lot less tables and chairs than they've been approved for. That, you know, we're pretty sure of that, you know, so that's one group. The second group, potentially, and really want to stress, this is a, you know, a phase 1 draft. The next potential group would be, and so those questions are obviously taken care of, bathrooms, you know, you're associated with a restaurant. The second group would be businesses that already exist, restaurants, bars, eating and drinking establishments on streets that could apply for a sidewalk cafe that don't have a license or have an application pending right now. That also would be, you know, that group also could be taken care of. The questions are simple, much more simplified. We know what the rules are. They're going to have to, and again, it would be associated with, you know, with a bathroom and a restaurant inside. A third group would be streets and or lanes of streets. Now we're starting to get into what's complicated. Clearly, in my mind, DOT is going to not let anybody out there unless they put up barriers, you know, unless they're convinced that it's, you know, that it's safe. They're not looking for lawsuits and, you know, and accidents. NYPD has concerns, you know, frankly. Whether there's a potential out in another borough of a Stone Street kind of situation. But even in those situations, in my mind, and again, this is my mind, I'm imagining those are going to be associated with restaurants that are right opposite that space, not 20 blocks away. So I think it's clear who's going to be responsible for those things. If, you know, if I'm on Broadway and a lane of Broadway opens up and I got a 30-foot wide, you know, restaurant and I can get 30 feet of that lane, that's my 30 feet. It would be delineated somehow. I'd be responsible for sanitation, you know, et cetera. A fourth group, which is even potentially more difficult, and I'm glad Tim Tompkins is on, is plazas or park space, which I'm not sure the city is going to go for any sort of park space, to tell you the truth. I think they want to keep that, you know, that more open. But if they did, that gets even more complicated in plazas because you don't have a restaurant directly necessarily there. So, you know, if Tim wants to open up a portion of Times Square Plaza, I'm not sure yet what the mechanics of that would be. Who is going to be operating that, if anybody? Or is it just going to be tables and chairs put out that a BID is going to be responsible, you know, to clean? And people could buy, you know, once the restaurants open up, they could buy their food and beverage and bring it there. By the way, I should also say that obviously the SLA is going to have to be involved in all this as well. Otherwise, there won't be any drinking at any of these locations. There'll only be eating. So they're going to have to, through an executive order, allow these restaurants to expand to these portions of, you know, of spaces that aren't currently part of their licensed space. So it's a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts, yeah. I mean, the food service establishments, essentially, they would have an application to DCA to operate in an open space that was identified by DOT. As you said, some are currently zoned already, but restaurants could also operate in privately owned spaces, even parking lots. has been suggested.
All right, let's get a few more questions. Aaron Ford.
Thanks, Nick. One of my questions, and you sort of touched on it in your last response, was the proximity to existing businesses, right? So say DOT decides 25th Street from X Avenue to X Avenue is a great opportunity for this, just as an example. You know, what the interesting thing that I'm sort of struggling with is like, well, what if I'm on 24th Street? My business is not going to be able to take any advantage of 25th Street being open. So how would you propose to sort of fairly parcel out, you know, the demand for those spaces? You know, are you going to be renting them by, like, I would think there's going to be a lot of sort of maneuvering in terms of what locations get picked based on what locations could take advantage of it. And would you set up a situation where it doesn't have to be an adjacent restaurant? Because I think that could be a very unfair tactic for certain locations and certain businesses, based on how those decisions are made in terms of what streets are picked, if it has to be an adjacent business. But then to the other comment about, like, it doesn't have to be, you could be setting up not even, you know, adjacent to your business. I think that just opens up a lot of questions, and I was curious if you had thoughts on that.
We did, and while you're right, you know, there are issues associated with that, but it's also the practical operational issues. If 25th Street is opened up and I'm on 24th Street, what does that mean? How could I possibly service 25th Street as an ongoing restaurant? We're not going to be cooking out on the street, and, you know, we're certainly, you know, we're not looking to set up, you know, tents and barbecues. So from a practical matter, I don't know that it's, you know, it's workable for a restaurant to be having seating anywhere other than something that's really proximate to their restaurant.
Okay, let's hear from Craig Slutskin.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, Robert. I have a few questions. The first question is, and I'll just ask the three of them, and you can answer in any order you want. Has anybody estimated what the actual cost to the city is? So putting up all these barriers all the time, keeping it monitored, there's a cost. The police department, there is going to be additional sanitation. Even if the individual shopkeepers are responsible, there's still going to be an impact on the sanitation department. That's number one. Number two, you actually touched upon or briefly said, you know, park space. So I have to ask, is there any actual proposal being developed to use park space, whether it's the Bryant Parks type parks or the, you know, smaller parks? Is there any actual proposal on that? And the third is, how are hours on this outdoor space going to be determined? Because as you know, as you are fully aware, something might have a restaurant might have a 2 o'clock close indoor, but a 9 o'clock outdoor. How is that going to be decided, especially now that you're going to have maybe 5 or 6 or even more places on one block open outside late? So it's going to be noise on speed, so to speak. So how is that going to be determined?
Cost to city, obviously, I'm not been involved with that. As an advocate for the industry, I would say the cost to the city by not doing something like this is much greater than the cost to the city in doing something like this, getting businesses open and operating and people employed and taxes flowing. Second, to my knowledge, park space is not, it has not been part of any conversations I've been involved in because for a variety of political reasons it has not been. And third, hours, that's one thing we want feedback from the community boards. If a lane of traffic, you know, is going to open up, what are you guys comfortable with the closing time there? I know Community Board 2, you know, said 9 p.m. You know, seems reasonable to them. CB4, I think was a little bit later, depending on which avenue it might be. But that's something that we need the community boards to let us know what you would be comfortable with.
But that's not going to be sort of all of Manhattan is automatically 9 p.m. That's going to be street by street. Is that the intention, or do we not know that?
Yeah, I think this is going to be discussed tomorrow when it's introduced. It's a fledgling introduction.
Sure.
Parks are not involved as far as I know. The land use had mentioned possibly parking lots with the permission of an owner, for instance. These are suggestions. As far as the cost, I would have to get back to you tomorrow after the hearing because I just learned about this morning, so I'm working on it.
Thank you. All right, let's hear from Ryan Whalen.
Robert, thank you for your testimony. You cited examples of other cities around the country now, around the world, that are starting to do this. And so I'm curious which cities and any kinds of tactics, physical layouts, protocols, methods of operation that you see as being particularly promising for New York City, and you think that we should look to as examples to imagine what this could look like in our own district here.
So listen, honestly, New York is, New York, and while it's a good talking point for me to say it's happening elsewhere, and it is San Francisco, Connecticut, whatever. Many of the areas, cities where they're doing this in Europe as well, there are food areas. I mean, there are concentrations, there are, business districts, where they have a huge, concentration of restaurants, and we probably have, 500 streets, in the city of New York where there's a lot of restaurants. And they're on every street. So this is not going to work everywhere. In Greenwich Village, on Morton Street or whatever, we have a pre-existing non-conforming use where a restaurant was there 90 years ago and it's a residential block. I don't see this happening, quite frankly. So yeah, it's happening elsewhere, and it's more of a challenge for us, no question about it. But I think there are, with reduced traffic of cars, I think there is an opportunity. I like the idea that it seems to me there are plenty of places, one block on Columbus Avenue in the Upper West Side, maybe Park Avenue South in your district. It seems to me there are plenty of areas where it's possible. I got to tell you honestly, I don't know that every restaurant's going to want it, even if it's available. I mean, quite frankly, if you're a high-end restaurant, and listen, I've always been a straight shooter with you guys. If you're a high-end restaurant and you're closed now, this is not going to get you open. That's for sure. If you're a restaurant that is doing takeout and delivery right now, well, then this would be a godsend because you're open anyway. And if I could put a few tables and chairs even on the sidewalk in front of my space, that's a plus, no question about it. If I'm a place with a sidewalk cafe and I have 15 tables and 30 seats, and I'm being told it's going to now be 6 tables and 15 seats. But I can get a few more tables and seats back because they're closing a lane by me. Well, that might be enough for me to hire, get some waiters and waitresses interested in working again. For 2 or 3 tables, they're not going to. They'll stay on, quite frankly, on unemployment at least through July 28th because they're collecting $1,100 a month, a week now. And when the federal unemployment ends, July 28th, there's going to be a lot more people that want to come back to work. We want to have opportunities, well underway for them. So, yeah, there are other cities doing it, but it's easy. They're doing it on their stone streets, basically. We have a tougher time, which is really why we need all the community boards to get involved, and because you guys are the experts of your neighborhoods.
Got it. Let's move to Nancy Goshow.
All right. So I live on 7th Avenue in Chelsea, and there are already some bars serving alcohol, and people are standing on the sidewalk. They are not social distancing. They are not wearing masks. I have to go out into the street to get past them so that I am not infected by any of them. So I'm wondering, how will patron behavior be monitored? Who will be responsible for that? Because when you drink alcohol, you become a little looser than your normal behavior. And there was recently an article about a restaurant in on the Cape, where the operators were very concerned because the patrons were behaving very badly. And they asked the question, it's a lunch counter, do we need to hire a bouncer? So what provisions do you have for that? That's one question. The second question is, how do food trucks interact with this? Because they are selling food on the street also. How will that, and that's always been an issue to resolve. And then the third thing is, if you have tables on the sidewalk, will the distancing be the same so that pedestrians can walk past? Or will they take over the whole sidewalk? And if they do, where do pedestrians go? And I walk to my office twice a week. So I'm out on the sidewalk seeing this going on. There are a lot of people that are not wearing masks, that are not doing social distancing, and it's a little scary for me. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Let me take the last question first. We are not proposing, and I don't believe anybody else is proposing, for any tables and chairs on the sidewalk for there to be any relaxation of the sidewalk cafe, clearance requirements. We understand that sidewalk needs to be shared, and we think that's an important element here. That clearly there are people in the restaurant industry that want to do that, that want to be able to take up more sidewalk space temporarily for one season. Our Hospitality Alliance is not behind that. We think we want to get community board support, and we know that a price of admission for that is not to take up any more of your sidewalk. So that's number one. Number two is, listen, restaurants, there are 1,300 sidewalk cafes. When is a legal structure for it, and you're out there and you have a permit, 98% of the restaurants operate their sidewalk cafes just fine. We don't think this will be any different. What we do think is that now, once there is a lawful option, then the Wild West of people deciding on their own to sit around and not socially distance, will be reduced. What we're going to see, we're afraid, in the next few weeks is an exacerbation of the Wild West out there, because they don't have a lawful option and they don't have businesses with something to really lose here to say, you got to sit in one of these tables. Otherwise, I could lose a permit, and I'm not going to serve you if you're going to be standing here. So I think I think we help regulate the sidewalks better by doing something like this temporarily during this emergency.
Right.
And then food trucks. Does anyone have an answer about food trucks? That's a good point.
I mean, to be honest, I don't, but it's something that I'll bring back. But I also want to tag on to what Robert said. I mean, we're getting a lot in the district office. We're hearing a lot about the Wild West, especially in the village. And when you have 3 agencies involved, DCA, DOT, and DOHMH, you're going to have controls.
And the police.
We don't have right now.
The police have said, we meet with the NYPD all the time. They said, we would like something structured so that we don't have to waste, police department time walking around and doing all this stuff. As far as food trucks, there is in the round 1 legislation tomorrow, there has been a lot of pressure, I've been told, from the food vendors for a temporary relaxation. It's not my part of the bill. They want a temporary relaxation of some of their placement requirements as well. But what I've said is, listen, I certainly don't want a situation where we go through all of this, we identify a lane, DOT approves the lane, there are restaurants opposite that who are going to use that lane, and now we have a line of hot dog carts, on the sidewalk between the restaurant and the lane, and I was assured that that's not going to happen. So we'll see.
Thank you, Robert. BJ Sung, let's hear from you.
Thank you. Robert, I had, actually, I'll try to narrow it down. So I have specifically 3 questions. One was regarding the survey that was sent out, asking for suggestions for sidewalks and to be considered for this cafe. So I was curious about the diversity effort in terms of outreach. I realized that it was sent around, so I'm wondering, I wanted to know who it was sent to, and was that survey sent in multi-language, because if you're talking about 5 boroughs, especially in Corner, Queens, and Elmhurst, or even certain parts of Uptown, they don't necessarily, it's not just English oriented. So, has that outreach been done to make sure that there is enough diversity and inclusion and equity in the survey to be included? The second one is, having lived down nearby Wall Street and a frequent customer of Stone Street and the areas, Stone Street, when it gets crowded, even though I see that it's been cited on multiple documents and letters, it was never social distancing. Even though the cafe model may be something that's worthy of looking at, when you go there during spring to fall, it is jam-packed. So how would having these outside restaurants or outside cafe or these facilities actually be able to accommodate that 6 feet or 2 meter apart, right?
I would add something to her question as well, which I think is about capacity. What about queuing? You know, if I can tag on to your question, BJ, I'd like to hear about queuing as well. What's your third question?
Right, and the third question is the narrow streets. We know there are certain parts even in our district that doesn't have streets, right? So they cannot accommodate this type of patio sitting or the David Rockwell kit. So how are they going to be left out of this option? You know, because like when you look at 32nd Street, Cape Town, 35th Street, certain streets, 41st Street, there's not enough space, let alone pedestrian or cars to go through. So what's going to happen with these streets that don't qualify for this? And then if I could tag along with that is, you know, who's going to pay for these kits? Or is there going to be some sort of stimulus to help restaurants put up these David Rockwell kits? Thank you.
We were obviously thrilled that David Rockwell reached out to us pro bono with some ideas, but the legislation is not a David Rockwell kit legislation. I mean, for those who can afford it, I don't know. I think he has some public interest money behind donating some. That's not what I anticipate seeing everywhere. So, you know, it's nice and it's interesting. And there are other architects who are donating time to deal with the social distancing aspect. But at the end of the day, you know, BJ and Nick, is that, you know, the governor is going to, and the health department are going to decide on what the social distancing requirements are. And outdoor is going to have to comply, and clearly it's going to be a lot less than current sidewalk cafes have. And if streets are too narrow to accommodate anything, well, then they're too narrow to accommodate anything. There's nothing I could do about the width of the streets. If that street can't be closed down for a variety of safety or other reasons, and if the sidewalk is too narrow to allow for any seating, especially the new required social distancing seating, then yeah, I mean, not every location in the city of New York will probably have outdoor dining. You know, and we can't on the one hand satisfy Nancy's concern about not taking up more sidewalk space, and on the other hand, when there's a narrow sidewalk space, say let's take up the whole sidewalk space. So, you know, we can't do both at the same time. As far as the survey, you know, we're not government. You know, we're a private not-for-profit. So we sent our survey to every community board, to every city council member, to every state assembly person, and every state senator, and every business improvement district. We're leaving it to all of you to do your outreach in, you know, and how you handle your outreach. That's really not our job.
Okay, Jordan Goldman, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Nick. My first question was actually answered by Lori H. Was the time frame for when this was supposed to take place, and it sounds like October is the
expiration.
Right, the expiration. So my concern is that that's not too far away. Obviously, by the time it gets colder, no one's going to want to sit outside and eat. So that makes sense to me. But, and it's been touched upon, you know, Times Square is very different from the West Village, is very different from the Upper West Side and, you know, Upper Broadway. And at some point, we're going to have to draw lines and make decisions. And my concern here is that we're going to take 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks hearing from every single stakeholder. And you know, it's happened. We've all been on matters and committees where things get dragged out. That's really not an option here. So do we have a plan? And this may be for you, Mr. Bookman, or for Lori, as to expedite this process, understanding, of course, that there are at least 3 agencies and multiple other stakeholders.
Well, the fact that the hearing is next week is already expediting it. It's being introduced and a hearing next week. So yeah, that piece is already in place.
Well, the mayor hasn't committed to this yet either, I mean, for that matter. So you know, we could have all the expedited timeframes that we want. At the end of the day, the mayor is going to have to work with us on it, and the governor is going to have to sign off on it. So we're moving as quickly as we can. Realistically, I think June is kind of shot, unless the governor surprisingly says, and we've been asking, in New York City, can we have safe outdoor dining if the city wants it in phase 1? If he did something like that, or even phase 2, that would expedite the process. But right now, even if all the stakeholders and the city council and the mayor agrees, and the governor says it's not going to happen until phase 3, well, we're into you know, July anyway.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
I've got two more hands of committee members. If there are no more committee members after that, then I'll turn to the public. So the public should start thinking about if they want to comment. Todd Shapiro, let's hear from you.
Oh, hi. I'm just picking up on what Craig said. I mean, in normal times, when we have to consider sidewalk cafes and the introduction of this sort of activity on the streets, we're very careful about weighing the residential labor, with residential buildings right nearby, also the relative activity of the pedestrians on the various streets. So obviously on an expedited basis, all of that is going to, you know, go out the window. So, you know, how are we as a community board going to deal with this? I mean, our district in particular has more restaurants than anybody, and it's got all this new residential. So are we going to be able to give anybody a chance, the residential people, to comment on this? I mean, it seems like an overwhelming task. And then, of course, do we really know, right? Like, taking up, we don't really know what the level of activity is going to be, you know, given the pandemic. The street that we're taking away to get to the restaurants, or that we're taking away from the pedestrians, how do we even really know what the activity is going to be? Is there going to be anything in place where, you know, we'll be able to take feedback from our residential, the residential people in our district, and be able to enforce or change the seating arrangements or the permissions that we give? How are we going to deal with this?
Yeah. I'm having a little trouble hearing Todd, but I think the gist of his question is, you know, what kind of feedback are you going to accommodate as we have hotspots, as we have issues? How would you address that, or how do you anticipate that will be addressed?
I'm sorry.
Anybody hear what I said?
Yeah, Todd, we're having trouble with your connection.
Well, from the best I can gather, I'm saying is what we're looking at here is a temporary few-month emergency process, unprecedented for an unprecedented time. Obviously, it cannot go through the normal process the 5-month process that a Sidewalk Cafe application goes through, because it'll be November. So it's going to be something different. It's going to be something expedited, and it's going to be limited for this, you know, for this. And there's a lot of balancing and weighing going on, but we've got to understand that, as I opened up with, this industry has been decimated. Your neighborhoods are, if we don't take more action to help small businesses, your neighborhoods will look like ghost towns when this is over with shuttered stores. So we've got to do something to get these businesses operating.
Okay. Let's go to Mary Brosnahan.
Thanks, Nick. Robert, thanks for your presentation. I couldn't agree more that this situation is urgent. These restaurant owners are on the ropes and we need to do whatever we can to help them. My only note of caution is in the wake of shutting down 14th Street to vehicular traffic, what I've seen and many others is Park Avenue South has become total gridlock. Polly Trottenberg was supposed to release data on the changes in traffic flow. That never happened. And I would just caution if you're doing it. And what is going north and south, I would just add a note of caution if you're going to put another chokehold on those areas.
I completely agree with you, Mary, and I think we're going to, if we do something like this, we're going to need to be nimble. The agencies that are handling this will have to be able to respond. There may be streets that they open that turn out, after 1 month, it's a disaster, and we end it, and it's ended on that street. Nobody's getting a contract here to operate till the end of October. They're going to get it until until the permission is revoked, if it needs to be revoked sooner. So I agree with you, Mary, and it's going to have to be ongoing. Or there may be streets that after it opens, and people say, why didn't we do, those from 18th to 21st Street on 6th Avenue on the left side of the street? Why is that, not? So I think it might look different by September than it does in July.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to flag Park Avenue South in particular.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. EJ, back to you.
Yeah, just kind of one question in summation. Hearing certainly that you're hoping to defer to the community to choose, what blocks get closed off, what streets are most appropriate for, say a lane configuration versus a whole block configuration. So, understand entirely your inclination to sort of defer that to the community. It is in a sense a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, yes. Not knowing exactly what the source of the initial proposal would be, and certainly certain things that sound like they would get decided on a block by block status, the way that, say, PSQL and the State Liquor Authority give individual establishments requirements around noise and hours, et cetera. So just trying to extrapolate out how these things get decided. Lori, am I right in understanding that the legislation at this point is going to leave it up to the city and DOT to propose individual streets?
Yes, that's my understanding as of right now. The DOT is responsible for the framework of the appropriate streets that would work in the neighborhood.
Upon consultation, the draft language requires them, upon consultation with community boards, block associations, BIDs, and restaurant trade associations. I don't know how that one got there.
Got it. Okay. So, I mean, without having a specific order of operations right now, it sounds like one potential one would be legislation goes through certain permutations, gets passed, gets signed off by the governor. All these things would need to happen. At that point, the city takes, say, whatever surveys have been completed or anything like that, and then makes their own determination about what blocks to close. And then at that point, perhaps, I don't know, comes back to the community to get buy-in on those particular streets, or to get further restrictions on hours and noise and rules and sanitation and things like that. Stop me if any of that sounds wrong or infeasible, but that's sort of what I'm hearing from what the order of operations could potentially be.
I agree with the exception of the last part. I don't know that it's then going to come back to. I think your time for input is now, the next couple of weeks. If legislation is passed and DOT is required to reach out to you at that, then again, I think once all that's done and streets are identified, I think by that time there will be rules in place. I don't think it's going to be a location by location thing for like hours and stuff. For example, I think it'll be clear. Let's say no outdoor music. That's going to be clear. I anticipate that there's going to be more standardized, closing hours. It's not going to be location by location, situation that, this emergency permit will come with permission to operate until 9 p.m. and no earlier than, 10 a.m. or something like that. That's my anticipation. So I think you're right up until that point, because I don't think there's going to be yet another round of now let's talk about restrictions we want on that particular street. That would bring us into September already.
Right.
Okay. So that's very helpful. So whatever recommendation the community, whatever input the community wants to have, has to happen before and up to when the city starts making those determinations.
Sooner the better. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Will Heyer, we'll hear from you.
Hey, thanks, Nick. I understand the motivation behind this, and what I'm about to suggest, I think I'd be shocked if this is the case, but I'm curious if the city or any entity is planning or has the ability to collect any sort of rent, or if there's some action in the bill to prevent anyone from collecting a rent. And the question is really coming around from a concern that we've seen something similar happen with public plazas, where a city agency like the DOT gets a taste of a little extra revenue by renting out public space. And then suddenly we have shipping containers or other structures lining our streets. And now we can't afford to remove them because of the lost revenue. So I understand that there's an expiration date here, but I'm still apprehensive about these types of projects and the idea of A, collecting rent from public space, and B, that there's inherently this sort of picking of favorites that's going to happen depending upon which blocks are lucky enough to get selected. So I have to say, I'm just generally more in favor of leaving the street. If we're going to do something, I would say let's just leave the streets open for a dedicated right of way to give pedestrians and cyclists more space.
Well, I understand your position, but you will lose a lot of neighborhood restaurants in that case. They will not be able to afford to reopen.
Okay. Last committee member, we'll hear from Jamie Kang, and then I'll turn to the public.
Great.
Jamie?
Thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for all the input here. I had 2 points. So the first was around the outdoor seating. I read news that there are parts of Illinois that are doing two things in a more innovative way, like first being like waiving restrictions for the permit or simplifying it in some way. And I just want to make sure that that's emphasized, because I think by adding all these complex rules around this is stressful for business owners, and want to be mindful of that. And if there's any possibility to waive it, if it's an outdoor seating for less than 6 people, I think that's sort of what's been going around in the country, then that would be something that's really important, right? Like if you're literally adding six chairs outside, it shouldn't have to go through, weeks and weeks of people looking through paperwork. And I think, if we can simplify the process for owners who tend to be, sometimes foreign as well, right? Like it's hard to access all this information in a congruent way. That would be helpful to kind of save the businesses in the area. And in terms of the concerns, I feel like, let me know if this is different. I'm on Fifth Avenue here. There are no tourists on Fifth Avenue right now. Half of my friends in New York City have moved out at this point to New Jersey, Connecticut. I'm from Massachusetts. I don't think that, we're gonna get lots of traffic. So I sometimes don't really see or agree with, the hesitation around even, the fear around being outdoors, because frankly, there aren't many people in Manhattan, and there probably won't be for the next few months. So I think, just supportive of the idea that we should be expediting this sooner, and also lessening regulations to be mindful of the local business as well as the economy overall in the country. And I think a second point that I wanted to add is, I think we should also think more critically in terms of yes, indoor seating should be limited, right? Because now we have to be distanced. But I think sometimes there's even more risk to being outdoors, right? Like there's some people who might have allergies. There's a lot of dust and pollen and pollution out there in New York City. People might be getting sicker by being outside. So I feel like questioning that assumption, that innate assumption that we're making that being outdoors is simply safer, is somewhat important here too.
Okay, those are good comments. I don't think we need to respond to those.
I just want to let Jamie know that the first draft of the bill does have a very simplified process for this, with Consumer Affairs required to act within 5 days of a very simple application.
Great. Noah Stern, I understand you want to speak, but you can't seem to raise your hand. So we'll recognize you, Noah.
Hi. So there are lanes for bikes on 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th avenues. So how will that kind of change the bill in some way? Just because now you're trying to have tables with bikes coming in theoretically from the tables to the kitchen. So how does that change kind of
Good question.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
But these are going to be appropriate sidewalk cafes. They're not spilling into the street, you know, I mean, and DOT is responsible for the bike lane. So you have to imagine that they are going to assume, you know, take that responsibility of what will work and what won't work.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor to the public now. I've got 3 people waiting to speak so far. If there's anyone else, please click your raise hand button. Tim Tompkins, you've been waiting quite some time. Let's hear from you.
Hi. So first of all, just thanks for the really thoughtful conversation. Also want to thank Corey for just, you know, pushing the envelope on the idea of opening up some of the streets and entertaining this bill, and Andrew and Robert for just really just trying to do something which is just critically needed. I think, you know, there's been so many conversations, and, you know, Times Square has big chains, but also Times Square has a lot of smaller restaurants, and overall in the city and throughout the, you know, every part of the community board, there's a real concern about protecting and keeping small and independent businesses. And this really, I think everybody knows, this really is existential. And I also think that particularly in the restaurant business, everybody in New York knows that, you know, there's a lot of people, yes, who are able to get sort of unemployment insurance, but there's a lot of people, especially back of the house people in restaurants, who have literally no safety net. And so the ability to even get restaurants coming back in part is a critical part of getting them, you know, getting money into people's pockets who really don't have a safety net.
Tim, while we have you, and I understand we've got a few representatives from BIDS here, how do you think the BIDS can participate in this and be of service to this movement?
So I think that I think it's going to vary from place to place. I think that, you know, as always, we can try and be a liaison between the city and the individual businesses. First of all, we can just survey the rest. If the city says, hey, look, you know, we think these blocks are ones that make sense. If DOT does that, then we can go to the businesses on those blocks and say, hey, look, would you like to participate? We can make sure that, and we do think there should be a clear set of, I think there needs to be a clear set of guidelines, like, okay, you know, like as was talked about, like, okay, you know, these parking spaces within, you know, 50 or 100 feet of this business are the ones that can be used, and that there's some, you know, clarity about, you know, throughput on the sidewalk and all of that. So I think that basically we can be a facilitator, as we always are, in trying to make this happen. I think that the key things that come to mind for me are, you know, because of the urgency of the situation, you know, try it out, be flexible, have a really clear endpoint, and you've already mentioned one, which is sort of end of October, and also have a really tight leash. You know, there's 3 models already out there that are kind of percolating. DOT has the open streets thing. That basically got announced like a week ago and then opened up. Like, you know, like parts of Broadway are closed down. So the city has been shown that it's able to move quickly in response to both pressure from Corey, but also, you know, wanting to do something. There's also the Street Seats program, which doesn't quite match this, but with a little bit of tweaking could happen. And then also SAPO permits could be a tool. And in each one of those cases, part of what I'm suggesting is you may want to have a 30-day permit, you know, that this is revocable at the end of 30 days. So you have a really tight leash to say, if people aren't respecting social distancing, if there's, you know, a lot of problems going on, you can say this ain't, you know, we're going to take it back. But I would argue for, like, try it out, because it's, you know, this is such a critical situation. And that way also you can experiment with what are the different ways to to ensure that there's safety for pedestrians with respect to vehicles, that there's safety with respect to following the COVID social distancing guidelines, and you know, safety just overall. And I say this as someone who has consistently argued over the time that, you know, for the street sidewalks and plazas, you know, they exist for transportation purposes, throughput of pedestrians, bikes, and cars. They exist for civic activity, just being able to hang out and sit, and they exist for commercial activity. And the city, actually, longer term, the city has to have a much more rational and data-based way to decide how to divvy up those spaces, and they have to continue to modify their way in which entities like bids and you know, restaurants co-manage these public spaces in a way that respects the needs of the public and civic purposes. So, you know, overall, there's still a need for a lot more rationality, planning, information to drive decisions. But I think this is a really special case where acting really quickly, being nimble, having a really clear endpoint that this is a pilot program, and a tight leash so that, you know, you try it out on this block, it doesn't work for any one of those reasons, you pull a permit. And then again, you might be able to do that through a SAPO permit or through a modified, shorter term, more flexible open streets permit or street seats permit, or just the open streets system that just opened up last week. You add a couple of tools to it.
That's a good suggestion. Tim, are you suggesting that maybe the Times Square pedestrian plazas are a potential site for this?
So there are some of those same issues as, you know, there's different restaurants around there. How do you divvy it up? But we essentially, at the request of DOT, once COVID started, we took all of our tables and chairs off. If the governor and the mayor say it's okay to put them out at these set distances, maybe with the big circles or something like that, and that becomes a place where people can, you know, again, do essentially takeout and then go sit there, you know, then in the same spirit of things, in the shorter term, over the coming months, we're open to facilitating whatever helps, you know, businesses, and then saying this is a short-term interim solution. And obviously, you do that, you still let people sit out there if they just want to sit out there and not have food. So that could coexist with some of the other commercial offerings we have out there.
Good point. Thank you, Tim. Next up, Mary Messina.
Mario, just press unmute.
I did. Thank you very much, and happy to see that you are all fine. I have to thank you, Robert, for this great presentation, and thank you, Lori. I think that this project is quite ambitious, but I think that is very much needed. We had an emergency meeting with the 29th State Neighborhood Association yesterday to talk about this, and we believe that it has a lot of merits. Also, I believe that is not the only business or the only industry that is suffering right now, but for sure they need some help very badly. I come and I was born and raised in Italy, where basically eating outdoors is a custom, is a way of life. And I have to say that it is very well managed. For example, people are very careful about the neighbor, about don't raising their voice, and about being polite. And if sometimes, and this is a suggestion, somebody is doing or overdoing with his voice or just going bananas, the manager of the restaurant that goes by and very politely ask him to please obey, because the streets and the people that they are living there, etc., they need their own peace and quiet. We believe that depending on the streets and depending on the density of the neighborhood, probably the latest that a venue can stay open probably 11 o'clock at night without really devastatingly disturb the people that they're living in that block. I believe that is going to be very important to really set up some very strong and straight rules and advertise them so that the community and everybody, all the citizens, etc., understand what they're getting into and what they need to do. And again, like Tim just said, I mean, this is something that could be tested in a certain way and then, modified as we go along.
Okay.
I think that all in all, it is a great opportunity to help out an industry that is in terrible need.
Great. Thank you, Mario. Martin Whalen, you're next.
Hi, how are you? I'm with the Stout NYC Hospitality Group. We own 6, hopefully soon to be 7 bar restaurants in the district. And why that seems big, I have individual partners in all the places, so we're very much a mom and pop business. And when this came up, I saw it as a lifeline because there's just a very real chance this could be the difference between being able to make it through and not being able to make it through. And between all my places, we let go of 500 people. And as Tim and the Times Square Alliance brought up, some of those people don't have a safety net. And
Martin, let me ask you a question, Martin. From the operator's perspective, what are your ideas about specifically how this should be implemented, how things can be controlled, how this doesn't turn into the Wild West is a term that I've heard?
Well, everybody who's looking for this has already gone through the license application. So you know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
If they're good operators, you already know they're good operators. If they're problem operators, you guys already know they're problem operators. So there's that peace of mind. As for, the rules are, and we're hanging the posters, the open windows in the bars that exist now, when people hanging outside of bars, that's illegal. Drinking in public is illegal. It's illegal. We can sell cocktails to go with food, but they have to be, that'll be eliminated because people will be sitting down at tables. I just looked at the Rockwell sketches today. I didn't realize we'd actually be going into the streets, but I have seen that before. We do it every summer in New York. You have to remember this, there's gonna be no tourists in New York. Let's say conservatively, 30 to 40% of people are not coming back to their offices.
Let's stay a little bit more practical, Martin. Talk to us about enforcement. As an operator, from an operator's perspective, how do you see things being enforced?
Same way a Sidewalk cafe would be, I would assume. I mean, if I put too many tables out, which is the same way with Sidewalk Cafe, you get a fine. Or in this case, you could get your permit to open this, to run this temporary thing taken away altogether. I have no problem with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We may come to you as an operator for additional perspective. Thank you.
Feel free. Thank you very much.
Okay. Jonathan Hawkins.
All right, hey everybody. You don't have to see my face, so I'm sure that's good for everyone. I'm with the Garment District Alliance, and Martin, we're looking forward to having Stout open in the Garment District, hopefully soon. I just want to share a bit of what we've heard from speaking to our restaurant and bar owners in the Garment District. You've heard many of the challenges. They're overwhelming. Will tenants in the neighborhood come back to patronize the restaurants? Can they be viable at 50% capacity? All these questions. And on top of that, in the Garment District, since we have such a small residential population with no office tenants, no tourists, no Broadway, no Madison Square Garden, we're hearing concerns about will there be anyone to visit even if they open? So there are a lot of challenges, big picture challenges that are not necessarily for this board to discuss. And we've heard a lot about higher level things like rent relief and repeal of the commercial rent tax. But what we have heard is that while bigger things are needed, open street dining is a no-brainer and is something that would provide some help, and every little bit is needed. So we emphatically support measures to allow restaurants and bars to reallocate parking spaces adjacent to their business, which is currently impossible to have outdoor seating in nearly the entire Garment District because sidewalk cafes are banned, rightfully so, because of narrow sidewalks, high pedestrian volumes. So we envision businesses providing their own tables and chairs and maintaining and cleaning the space. We think the precedent of this existing street seats program is pretty good. Not, like Tim said, doesn't translate exactly, but there is somewhat of a model out there if it could be modified to let businesses conduct transactions and serve food and drink, including alcohol. And where the sidewalk is wide enough, we support allowing sidewalk cafes and for a limited amount of time with no licensing or fees. So we've heard a lot of support for this idea. I do have to mention a common cause that we continuously hear and heard earlier this week when we brought this up with businesses, which is an issue that's existed long before the pandemic and may become worse because of it, and that's the homelessness in our neighborhood, which is obviously one of the toughest social political challenges for the city, for the country. But a lot of our restaurant owners have said that with sort of the mass homelessness and more problematic, often untreated mental illness, they're kind of wondering how they can operate outdoor seating in that environment. And there's also, since we have about 10% of the city's hotel rooms in the Garment District, and a lot of those are being used as a temporary measure now while the subway is shut down overnight, there might be a little bit of an excess burden on the neighborhood there. So that's just something, I mean, I don't know how something like that is solved in the short term. I think the whole country would love to know, but it is something we heard a lot, so I felt like I needed to relay that as well. But overall, we're really excited about the possibility of this, and we hope that it moves forward quickly. So thank you all for discussing this, and we encourage you to use your voice to advocate for it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Antonia Culler, we'll hear from you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go. To jump on the last person who was just speaking, I live on 35th Street, West 35th Street and 5th Avenue. So our street has been kind of overrun by two things. One of them is homelessness, because they've taken over a hotel and made it a homeless shelter. And we have Amazon on our block, which has also kind of been social distancing and taken over the streets. However, we have 7 restaurants on our block which are suffering, and I would love to apply for this. This would be such a help for the restaurants on our block, because this is our lifeblood. There aren't a lot of residential buildings in this neighborhood, and we depend on these restaurants to be our neighborhood and our home. And it's devastating what's going on our block, to have not only Amazon, yet homelessness. So how do we apply for this and have our block put up there for this?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we will definitely keep 35th and 5th in mind, and we'll talk about including that if it's appropriate. Thank you, Antonia. Rob Burns, let's hear from you.
Good evening, and thank you for doing this. First of all, it's good to see everyone on Community Board 5 again. I'm just going to echo, first of all, I'm president of the East Midtown Partnership, which is the business improvement district in the northeast part of Community Board 5. And I'm just going to reiterate what you've already heard from people in the industry and my fellow bid directors. Restaurants are suffering. There is no indication whatsoever that they're going to be anywhere close to a capacity where they can make it for quite some time. Short-term delivery and takeout is helping, but it's not there. It's still a break-even kind of thing at best. And we have a couple nice months coming up. We don't have tourists. We do have the opportunity. We don't have much traffic, and we do have the opportunity to be creative right now. And so I would encourage Community Board 5 to approve this, and you're going to do a lot, I think, to do what you can to save the restaurant industry if you do approve this. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. The comments are starting to get a little bit redundant. What I'd like to hear from the public, if they do have something different to say, some unique comments, some specific concerns that have not already been mentioned, keep that in mind. And we'll go to Fred Cerullo.
Nick, I have a 7:30 meeting. I just want to let you know. I got to jump in like 8 minutes, all right?
Okay, thanks. Fred, do you have something new to say?
Well, what a setup that is. No,
That's my job.
actually, I know it is. But it is my job to try to sneak in the fact that we obviously are also supportive of sort of a creative version of how we can assist the restaurant community in sustaining itself and to.
Do you have any specific suggestions?
I have to say though, while originally, we were speaking sort of generally on this, the idea that there's legislation that is being introduced as early as tomorrow, I think is a good start for us to be able to get to the table and start to talk about what works for us and what doesn't. But I think we all need to be open-minded, and I want to acknowledge the questions that got asked by the committees tonight, which I thought were very thoughtful and help to inform the legislative process as we move forward. So thank you for the opportunity to say a few words without being completely redundant.
Thank you. Next up, Yafi Schaefer-Sull. Do you have anything new and specific to say?
Hi, thank you for everybody who's been speaking, and I represent the Fifth Avenue Association, the Business Improvement District on Fifth Avenue. And just a few, I agree with most of what everybody's been saying, and thank you for bringing all us together so that we can speak about this issue. I did want to bring up the topic of using signs and signage in general and trying to reduce the restrictions on signage so that businesses can better communicate the changes in their policies and be able to communicate with the customers without dealing with all of the city permits. And we also support the setting up tables outside and the liquor licenses that go along with those businesses, as long as we're making sure there's still an 8-foot pathway for the public at all times, basically making sure that we're not that everybody is represented on these streets and we're not displacing anyone here. And also to talk about, just bring up the small fact that we also have heard a lot about places where people are not really respecting the issues of social distancing. They're not acting in the safest manner. They're not really going by what we're supposed to be doing. And we've heard about a lot of these complaints coming to through 311 and being directed directly at the businesses. And I just wanted to voice some concerns that I've heard that ultimately some of these people that are congregating, it's not necessarily on the businesses, and we're looking for creative solutions where we can involve NYPD or other policing mechanisms to make sure that this does not hurt the businesses any more than they're already hurting from all of these changes. And we want to be an ally for the restaurants and businesses and not just put a spotlight on them to receive criticism for all the things that will need to be changed and evolved as we figure out what works best.
Thank you.
Thank
okay, great. That seems to be the last public comment. Is there anyone else that has something new and unique to say?
Nick, I should note that we have one person calling in from a phone. If they would like to raise their hand, they can press *9.
Okay, we'll give them a second to do that if they so choose. Okay. All All right. So I'm going to put the, Luke, are you okay?
Yeah, do you see the raised hands in the panelist section?
Yes. Is that a committee member or is that from the public?
I think that's a committee member.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is put the committee into business session. During this part of the proceeding, the committee discusses the agenda item amongst ourselves. At this point, no further input from the public is appropriate. And if we need something from Robert or Lori, we will ask them.
I got to run. I got the community board to talk to. If you need any further information, just email me or text me, Nick. I want to thank you guys. I've always loved working with Community Board 5. You're very reasonable. The industry needs your help now, and we hope you'll be there for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay. So during the business session, I talked about that. Let's hear from the phone caller ending in 394. Please tell us who you are.
Yes, this is George Highcollis calling. I'm sorry I couldn't be connected visually, but my computer doesn't work right, I guess. Anyway, lots and lots of wonderful thoughts, and the issue of a comprehensive approach, which Tim Tompkins brought up, was well phrased, so I don't need to add to that too much. I do think we need to better understand the role of streets and transportation, and also a staged recovery and what will happen during that recovery, so that things remain positive in terms of making life sustainable. I'll just leave it at that.
Great.
There's a lot of work yet to do, but I appreciate the wonderful work that the committee has done, and I'm glad that I could at least participate orally.
Thanks so much, George. Sam, let's hear from you.
Great. Sorry about that. I just needed to unmute. Look, I just had two comments. One is I'm very conscious that food and beverage establishments aren't going to be the only businesses that may benefit from the ability of trading outdoors. And there's a world in which retail outlets could be the first out of the gate, given that phase one, that they will be part of phase one. So I just think we need to be aware of that and consider what it means for other businesses as we go through these discussions, particularly if they're being provided with the option for curbside pickup, which I believe phase one offers them under the New York State plan. I'm also conscious to that end that street fairs may want to come back, and smaller businesses that work from those booths will want some space at some point. So we just need to be aware of that. Second, and equally as important, I think, is that while I appreciate that the Wild West situation is going to only grow more significant as the weather gets better, and as someone who solidly believes in harm minimization as a public health policy, my biggest concern is less about the consumer at this point, the person who chooses to eat and drink outside, than with the employees of these businesses. We've seen the virus do enormous harm to communities of color and impoverished communities. Those communities make up a lot of the food and beverage workers in New York. And I think it's really important that if we're putting those workers around people who by definition won't be wearing masks because they'll be eating and drinking, we have to be extremely cautious in exposing those workers to potential harm as well as pedestrians. So those are my two comments. And I think as we start to have further discussions, I just want them both in the back of our minds.
Great, thanks. EJ?
So I sort of just wanted to do a roundup on what to me seem like the major issues that we can weigh in on. Certainly it sounds like all of the bids are for this in principle. Certainly we've heard from very few people who are just like against this whole concept in principle, although there are a lot of really good questions that are raised about how it gets implemented fairly and safely, et cetera. And a lot of that will probably get decided down the road, but understanding the time frame with which this will probably, as we've talked about, get expedited and implemented. It seems like our opportunity to weigh in needs to happen soon, like for example, during our current board cycle. and that we could, if we want, chime in on 3 different areas, and we could choose not to chime in on any of these areas, but certainly the 3 things that seem to need to get answered are: what areas get closed, how do they get picked, what get closed, etc. Who's responsible for, certainly by Sidewalk Cafe rules, individual restaurants have responsibilities as well, but there are other responsibilities like safety and the barricades. And then thirdly, what restrictions get applied. And again, that could be a good opportunity for us to weigh in now. As was mentioned by Robert, it might have to happen in a more blanket fashion than the way that we usually assess establishments individually when giving them a liquor license or a sidewalk cafe license. But we could decide not to step into the issue of choosing the streets, but we could still decide what regulations belong on, say, what areas of our district or across the district entirely. It seems like it seems like if we wanted those types of regulation applied in a uniform sort of way, it would be a good idea for us to chime in on the early side here so that can be factored into any legislation or decision making that goes forward from here. So those 3 areas are, and folks can disagree, but those 3 areas are the areas that it seems to me that we can decide whether or not to weigh in on as a community board as this thing goes forward, and if we don't oppose it entirely.
Thanks, EJ. I would add a 4th one to your list, and that would be implementation. And sort of referring back to Tim Tompkins' comment about a 30-day revocable permit. I think if we're giving all of these operators and all of these streets the benefit of the doubt, let's make it a 30-day benefit of the doubt to see that we're not really, getting into trouble. So I would add number 4, implementation, to your list of suggestions.
Sure, great.
David Kelly, so let's hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Nick, for doing such a great job. Something that I'm concerned about is the city's responsibility. Should this go through, anytime there's a restaurant serving food in outdoor areas, you're going to have a rat problem. I've seen it in every restaurant I've worked in. I've been in the restaurant business as a bartender for over 40 years. So if you've gone to the 59th Street Boat Basin or the restaurant in Central Park, Tavern on the Green, Battery Park, there's always a rat problem where you serve food in outdoor areas. As it stands now, controlling the rat problem in sanitations and restaurant is an old archaic system that the city has. The Department of Sanitation only patrols the outside of the restaurant. The Department of Health separately patrols the inside of the restaurant. This is a very poor way of controlling the situation, especially if we're going to be having restaurants opening up, serving foods on the streets. The city needs to develop a task force where they combine the Department of Sanitation and the Department of Health. So in one sweep, they can patrol a restaurant, the area on the inside, the area in the back where the garbage is stored, the cleanliness in the front of the restaurant. This all needs to be done in one sweep. I had this problem here in my neighborhood. That's why I know so much about it. A restaurant had a rat out of control problem. It took me over a month waiting for the Department of Health to come one week, the Department of Sanitation to come the next week. If we're going to have restaurants serving food outside, we need a sanitation Department of Health task force to patrol the situation in one fell swoop and keep on top of the rat situation, which, as you all are aware, is getting out of control now. My 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Ryan Whalen, let's hear.
4 quick points. First of all, I am supportive of this. As Gail Brewer, as our board president, always reminds us, we are the business board, and I think this is a moment for us to step up for business in a really big way. Second point, I do agree with Sam that we need to be thoughtful about other business types that might have needs, interests, and demands for outside space, and how we can thoughtfully consider and accommodate those as much as is possible. Third, I think it's really important for us to follow the data here. We will have about as much information as I can recall the community board being able to get in near real time about anything that's going on in our district, both in the district, around the city, and frankly in other cities around the country and around the world. So when I think about a fifth thing for us to weigh in on as a community board, it's for regular and detailed reporting from the city on effectiveness and implementation here that is reported out to us on a regular basis to be able to see and understand and monitor and adapt. And not only on
that's a good point. Lori, did you hear
businesses,
that?
but frankly, this is the chance for us also on T&E to continue the conversation around the adaptation of our streetscape, and so information around traffic, sidewalk, and street use and so forth that we could get, I think, would be really interesting as well.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm taking copious notes, so.
Perfect, thank you. Joseph Frewer.
All right, thanks, Nick. I guess I had a few points in response to, I guess the first question that EJ raised, or the first topic that EJ raised, that we might play a role in deciding. And this is, the process through which we're deciding which locations are picked for these open streets or expanded sidewalks. And these are just my opinions, but I'm putting them out there. I'd be interested in hearing what other people think. Street parking, where available, seems like a great start, especially in business districts. The street parking is barely used right now, at least from me walking around up near Columbus Circle. And so that would be an easy way to kind of do a partial opening, maybe not take over the whole street and not worry about interfering with traffic. And I would also want to second, I forgot who said it, but someone earlier asked a question about bike lanes. And I know that simultaneously with this change, the city's also trying to help people who want to use bikes to get around do that more easily. So in terms of locations, I'd want the city to take extra precautions to protect not only existing bike lanes, but also, future locations of bike lanes that are actively being considered. I know there's a lot of expansion planning. And then I think my last point about that is that the process of choosing, I would hate to see, a lot of effort and resources put into closing a street and then one restaurant makes use of it or no restaurants make use of it for whatever reason. I was wondering if it might be helpful for, the restaurants themselves that would be willing to utilize these spaces, put in their requests, and then that can help the city or DOT decide which blocks to prioritize, right? To make sure that we're devoting resources to the blocks where you actually have able and willing restaurant owners who are going to take advantage of this. That's all I've got.
Good points. Thank you. Nancy, what do you have to say?
Okay, I'm very supportive of this program. I think it's really important that we save our bars and restaurants. It's the life of the city. It's very important. I do think that if the city isn't going to, maybe the bids need to do this, but put together a website that is free to all of the participating bars and restaurants and develop a map that everyone can see where these restaurants will be located, so all of us can actually go there and experience these restaurants and bars. Because one fear is, and I read this recently in the paper, there was a restaurant that opened up, not in our district, but in Chinatown, and no one came. So I think that publicity about where these streets and restaurants and sidewalk cafes are located is going to be very important to get the word out, because I don't know where else you would look. Unless a newspaper decides to write an article, where do you go? So I think there should be a website and a map showing all of these locations. And I think that should be part of the legislation somehow, and funding should be put in for that.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks, Nancy. So I see three more hands raised. We'll take those three hands, and then as a committee, I think we need to decide what action we're going to take tonight. If we want to sort of comment on some recommendations, if we want to follow EJ's structure of the 4 points to address, give that some thought, because after these three comments, I think we need to start looking at what we're going to do tonight. BJ Sung, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Nick. I just want to come back to,
I personally felt that Robert's responses to my question was not satisfactory to me. I think some of it was the way he said, if the streets are too narrow, they miss out. He said something about, oh, we're not in the survey business. We're not the government. We sent the survey out the way it was. That was not satisfactory to me. We are a very diverse city, right? And even in our district, there's so many restaurants beyond the restaurants that he represents. So I wonder about.
Let me help you frame your comment. What would you like to see done?
Diversity in their outreach with the multilingual effort, and that they keep in mind that when I walked around on Sunday, most of the restaurants that were open and that had lines outside were Mexican restaurants and empanada places, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they were surveyed or that public was surveyed. The second point is the way he framed it and the way it was positioned, it still felt like the restaurants that were more established will benefit from this, rather than the small mom and pop restaurants that are on these narrow streets or they might not have the access. So Nick, so my foremost point is about language access and the survey and multilingual diversity outreach.
Got it, thank you. Todd, let's see if your connection has gotten any better. And if it's not, turn off your video. I think that might help. Todd Shapiro, we'll go to you. Yeah, it's still pretty bad, Todd.
Todd, can you press the stop video button?
You ready? About now.
Yeah, that's
Much
better.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah,
Hello?
that's better.
Okay, so since my video is, okay, great. So a couple of things. As a small business owner, I think that we have to be strongly supportive of this. We can see from the comments of the bids and most of the other people we heard that there's seems to be a general consensus in support of doing this.
Yeah,
and
I'm hearing that also.
So we have to keep that in mind. And I think that I'm just trying to draw from the vast experience we have dealing with outside cafes and outside seating and the reality of what's going to happen when all of these, whoever's going to participate gets their ability to do this on an expedited basis. So I think that whatever resolution come up with,
Todd, I'm sorry, Todd, we're losing you. Yeah.
Sorry, Luke, Todd, I muted you.
Luke, maybe talk to Todd, have him dial in. Maybe have him call on the phone.
We have, and
I think there's a little bit of video lag, so we're hearing the last of this.
Yeah, that's not helpful. Maybe suggest to Todd that he use the dial-in. Maybe that'll work better. Or if he wants to, yeah, I think that's what he'd have to do. All right, Todd, we're going to ask you to dial in if you can.
Todd, check your email. I'll send you an email.
Okay, Sarah, last comment before we start discussing our next steps.
Okay, quick comment. And perhaps a note for Laurie. Is it required for staff members of these restaurants with the outdoor seating to wear masks? Because I'm certain the patrons will not. They don't anyway when I walk around and see what's going on, and they're eating. Just a point.
Well, again, I don't have all the particulars, but the fact that the Department of Health is involved, I would imagine will set some standards for how they are going to be equipped.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think safety would always be one of our concerns. Okay, so I'd like to get a feel from the committee what our next steps should be. are we feeling that we've discussed this enough and identified at least our initial concerns and suggestions, or are we feeling that we want to get more information? We want to see the press release, the presentation tomorrow from the speaker. Let's try to identify what our next steps should be. EJ?
Sure. Just to the sort of little structure I identified earlier, I would say if we hadn't even heard about the legislation like an hour ago, I think we would have had even less to go on in this conversation. So it was great that came out today. I think we'll have probably even more detail from it tomorrow. I'm not proposing a particular course of action because I don't know exactly what it would be. Certainly if we took a position today, I think it would have to be broad strokes and principles. Mm-hmm. I think that if we used another course of the board's action, if we deferred taking a position to some degree, we could maybe weigh in on some of the more specific particulars. I think us proposing particular areas or streets tonight, just throwing them out there without some sort of, as we always say, comprehensive look at the whole district is very difficult.
Or would, instead of that, would the committee want to consider sort of certain qualities?
I
Streets
think that are could be, or the way that we sometimes use a matrix to identify.
I like that.
Yeah, like certainly the Department of Transportation will probably try to identify streets that have more than a few restaurants on them and would not impede the flow of traffic, and are not perhaps primarily residential so as not to upset a maximum number of residents. We could sort of define certain criteria that DOT or whoever ends up choosing could use in the selection of those areas.
All right, so for this matrix, number of restaurants, how residential the location is, pedestrian traffic. Anyone else chime in if you've got other characteristics that you think would be appropriate for the matrix? You could just speak.
Sanitation and enforcement.
I just want to, this is Matt, I would just add, there are definitely going to be winners and losers. And so having some very transparent, I mean, we can put together a matrix, but also suggesting that the city also get very clear reasons, as opposed to we weighed these things broadly and kind of here was the output. The more specific those can be, I think the better, or transparent.
Got it. So transparent qualifications, transparent requirements.
Transparency and why they selected what they selected.
Okay, transparency in the decision-making process. Some sort of rubric-driven thing that people can really see.
Okay. Anyone else have ideas for this matrix?
Nick, I appreciate the usage of matrix and, resorting to what we typically have used and worked really well for outdoor cafes. But I'm of the belief that this is very urgent. And I'm of the belief that we should just make all restaurants qualified to do this. And it is up to the operators and restaurant owners to decide if they want to participate. In terms of the 30-day permit period, I think, again, considering the urgency of the situation, I'm of the belief that we should give people the benefit of doubt and setting up some sort of parameter. If too many violations, too many complaints uncured after 7 days, then they will have to go through some sort of process to cure it formally. Let's remove the deterrence. Let's help the restaurants stay open. I think it will, at the end of the day, improve the street safety for a lot of the residential buildings that's, you know, surrounded by major office buildings, commercial buildings that are mostly empty. From a personal perspective, I have not been able to go outside after 5 o'clock. I don't feel safe. If 7th Avenue had restaurants, open seating, if 29th Street had open seating on the street, I would feel much safer.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Nancy, let's go to you.
I think we should support this in the broadest possible way and just have everyone stay in touch with us as the legislation is promulgated and as decisions are made. And because I think this is urgent also, these small businesses need help right away. It may already be too late for some of them, but we need it right away. So I think we should write something supportive, and maybe we don't have to get into specifics, but Lori has heard all of our issues, and we could just list what all of our concerns are and maybe do something like guiding principles. These are the things that we would be expecting the legislation to include. 1, 2, 3, 4, and just list those items, because we've brought up all the things that we're concerned about. That would be my next step.
Sure. Okay. David Kellis?
Oh, yes, something about following the governor's 5-step program, whatever that would be.
Can you be, I'm not sure what you mean.
You mean the
governor, the governor's step program for opening up the distancing in the city? Just something in the matrix about following his guidelines.
Oh, okay. Got it. Okay.
Is it worth encouraging? I was just going to say, encouraging them to prioritize restaurants that don't have violations in the past. I know we've had a set of them that were very troublesome and that we could probably assume would not be great actors.
Right, okay. Let me get a quick show of hands from the committee. How many people are supportive of this matrix to help identify locations in the district, as opposed to just picking and choosing locations? We'll develop this matrix to help guide that decision.
Nick, is that exclusive of Nancy's idea of making a list of your concerns?
I sort of think of it as along the same lines, providing the principles that we would like DOT to use in the selection of the ultimate, in their selection of areas to close.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's just see by clicking raise hands what kind of support we have for the matrix idea. Okay, I'm going to lower all the hands, and then let me see if anyone, Luke, can you lower hands for me? After all the hands are lowered, let me hear if anyone is opposed to this matrix idea. So Luke is going to lower all the hands, and then we'll give people an opportunity, if they are opposed to the matrix idea, to let us know. Anyone opposed? I'm not seeing any. Okay, so no matter how we won. July, you're opposed to the matrix idea?
I think it would just take too long to implement for the different departments to figure things out, and confusing for small businesses.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, we haven't seen that historically with our matrices. I think typically they have been very well received and clarifies things, but I think you make a valid point. Blaga, are you saying something about the matrix, Blaga?
Yeah, I agree with Julie. I totally support Julie's idea, and I think we don't have time for this because this is urgent, and city, and especially Manhattan, and the heart of Manhattan is in crisis if we wait so long.
Thank you. Okay, Nancy?
Okay, I agree with Blaga and July. I think that we could put in with the caveat that we don't want the process to be slowed down by this matrix. But if we were doing it, but we will present it as a selection matrix, but not if it slows the process down.
Sure, that's fair.
Right.
Kelly?
Hi, I just wanted to also say that I thought an earlier suggestion about making this resolution adoptable by other small businesses, including retail, was really kind of beneficial to thinking about how that would help small businesses across the city. And so if we did do a matrix, would that then further slow down other businesses also getting some sort of access? So then I kind of support July as well. I think that we should just try and fast track it so other businesses could also fast track outside access.
Great. Simon?
I haven't been in New York for a couple of months now, and July shared something for me which I think was really powerful about getting people back on the streets to create a safer environment. I think that means expediting this and perhaps making sure that there are no delays in moving forward when we move forward.
Okay. EJ?
So just to clarify, I think there's two routes to go here. One is to come out against the legislation as it seems to be written, leaning towards leaving the decision making for what areas to close up to the city, like DOT. The other path seems to be what someone proposes, like a more blanket rezoning, essentially, of the entire district. I'm more on the former side because it's what's being proposed by the speaker right now. I think it's going to have more support because it allows the things to be done in moderation and with some selection. But just to be clear, if DOT is choosing the final areas, we're presenting, and we use a matrix internally to identify our own criteria, but we're not going to be able to apply that on an individual case-by-case basis. So I'm more than comfortable taking the criteria that we've talked about and putting them in a resolution to say that we're asking DOT to use these as guiding principles within what the legislation is proposing.
So you used a buzzword, EJ. You used the word resolution, which requires us to formulate a resolution, have a vote, and take it to full board, which isn't going to happen in 2 weeks. And if I'm hearing the majority of the committee at this point, getting the sense that people want something quicker. And
what would our alternative be?
Well, the alternative, and I think, Vicky, we'd need your input on this, procedurally, if we can sort of summarize the notes that we've had at this meeting and present something that is unofficial and informal, if that would serve a purpose, or if we should expedite a formal resolution or something. Vicky, what are your thoughts about procedurally where we go from here?
I think we have to expedite, but I'm sitting here and maybe it's my overall feeling about our board, which all of you know how I feel about CB5. We always do everything so thoroughly and we do it quickly, even though it's thorough. And so my feeling when I heard about the matrix, it's a typical way that Community Board 5 operates, and we get very little flack because of it. And so I know that the boards that have weighed in on it thus far, maybe it's not out there officially, but the reaction has been, well, how did they come to the conclusion to be so definite so quickly on so many streets and without proper input? And I would like to think that we can do it quickly, even with the kinds of things that are being discussed to get to that point. I think it's a combination. I think it has to be quickly, but I don't think it should be done to be done quickly, if you know what I mean.
Got it. I mean, I think I agree with you about the matrix. I think we've, you know, based on the input that we've gotten from the committee members, we've gotten a few components already. The number of restaurants on the block, how residential the block is, how much pedestrian traffic there is.
We're halfway there.
Right. Is there sufficient sanitation? You know, I think that handful of factors alone, I think, is your matrix right there.
Right. And we've also, I mean, believe it or not, it's almost the entire board that's in on this tonight. Like, you know, I wrote down everybody's name and it totals up to close to 50 people. If we all pitch in and work on this, we can get it done quickly. All of us just have to be, it has to be a real concerted effort. And it sounds to me like anyone who has spoken about this tonight from CB5 is really supportive, not just supportive, but, you know, almost to a bit of an emotional support. So I think if we all work together, we can get this information, we can put it together. As you said, we've gotten half of the matrix already and move forward quickly. I think we can do it.
So if I can sort of summarize what I've heard from the committee, what I've heard from the public, I'm hearing overwhelming support for the general support for the project with a handful of concerns, one being the duration of the temporary license, one being enforcement, the four categories that EJ outlined for us. I think that's the makings of a resolution. I think that's the so why don't we, let me see. I don't know, EJ, are you feeling strong enough about that to make a motion that be our resolution?
I think my question is, if we go the resolution route, does it not become official fast enough? Would something like, and I'm just going off of what was kind of said a minute ago, would something less official like a letter be able to be finalized in a more rapid time frame?
But if I may, you know, why can't we have the exec just ratify it? I mean, given that, especially as Vicky pointed out, most people on the board are actually here tonight, that the executive committee can actually look at this, ratify it, and be comfortable that there was an overwhelming consensus of the whole board, just from a procedural perspective.
And you're saying
a letter or a resolution?
If we did a reso.
I think you ought to decide first on which you want, and not make, you know, let's not make an assumption one or the other.
I have a suggestion, kind of just to resolve both trains of thought. Like,
Jamie?
I think first, hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First, you can kind of break it up into two steps, right? Like, first step, get the letter done in a week's time, right? An informal letter saying that there's overwhelming consensus, give quotes and examples of what we've discussed today. And then the second step being that matrix that we've already kind of halfway worked through, and really hashing out and kind of supportive of Vicky's idea that will kind of stay underground further, but kind of a two-step process, because I think I support sort of the idea that, you know, if we delay this further, it's just kind of too late for people. So it doesn't really matter, right? So if we kind of go through like the two stages, that may be helpful.
I think the consensus agrees with you there. So, you know, maybe what we do from here is the three chairs will draft a letter summarizing what we've discussed tonight, identifying our support, and that we'll get that out quickly. That can come from the three chairs, and Vicky, if she wants to sign on to that, that can go out immediately within the next few days, I would imagine. And then we can sort of fold that into a sort of, I would say it's sort of a resolution in progress, because we do want to see what's released tomorrow. We do want to see what happens over the next couple of days because this is moving very, very quickly. We would want to see the proposed legislation so we can comment specifically on that. So maybe what we do is we have our resolution in principle prepared, but we keep it open so that we can react and respond to the developments that we see in the future. What do the three chairs think about that?
That sounds good to me.
Agreed.
I think
Okay.
it's a great idea, Nick. What they want to know at this point in time is whether or not CB5 supports this. Of course we support it, and that's important, which is why I think Jamie's suggestion is a good one. We get a letter out and we do all the things that you just talked about in the letter, and then we start to quickly put together specifics.
Okay.
Perfect.
Nancy, you have your hand raised. Is there something additional you want to add?
So the board bylaws does not have any method for emergency resolutions.
It goes to exec, yes.
Yeah. So,
A resolution could go to exec.
okay, so I think in these times, there are going to be other issues that are going to come up. And I think we need to put in place some sort of emergency resolution protocol because I think there are going to be other things that will come up.
Yeah, and which is why I think the structure that we're discussing now accomplishes that, because we get the letter out immediately, which expresses all of the sentiment that we've discussed tonight, our support, some of our concerns, the idea about this, a matrix perhaps, and then we leave the resolution open until we've seen some of the other things that are going to happen. And maybe, I mean, Vicky, do you see the beginnings of that resolution here tonight? Should we vote on the outline of a resolution now, leaving open what we're expecting to see in the future? Or do we leave it up to exec to finalize the resolution based on what happens between now and exec?
I'm a little concerned because of what we don't know. So it's a rough choice.
So I guess the question is, are we comfortable crafting a resolution now, or do we just get the letter out now and hold the resolution until we have more information, until we see draft legislation?
I would feel comfortable with the letter going out immediately.
Okay.
Because I think there's enough discussion tonight that we can put in that letter to not just say we support it. There's a lot that was said tonight and many, many questions and suggestions that I think were really helpful.
Okay. All right. So I think that's what we'll do. The three chairs hosting the meeting tonight will draft a letter of support identifying the things that we discussed tonight. We won't need to take a vote tonight on any resolution. We will hold that open until we see what the further developments are. We see what the legislation includes, and we will have a resolution and comment at that point.
You know, the one advantage that we have through all of this is that when we do virtual meetings, if there's an emergency now, it's not a problem trying to get people, it's not as much of a problem trying to get people together. So if a week down the pike something happens and we want this group, we can say it's an emergency. I mean, we all feel that it is, and we can have this group weigh in again on whatever, you know, has come along that might be moving us in one direction or another.
Sure. Okay. I see there's some chat going on in the chat. If anyone has anything to say, raise your hand and say it publicly. We're not really allowed to deliberate on chat. It has to be public. So if there's anything going on in chat that somebody needs to say publicly, let's do it now. Okay, I don't see anything. Todd, do you have another comment? Let's see if we can hear you now. Yeah, no, still not getting with Todd. Okay, I think we have a way forward. The three chairs will draft the letter of support, and we will get that out quickly. I'm feeling that this meeting is over. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, I think we're done. Thank you, everyone. Luke?
We have the PSQL agenda item.
Yes. So this concludes the joint meeting. We'll be ending that now and proceeding with the second agenda item, which will be heard by PSQL alone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Okay. Let's just give people a minute to sign off, and Craig, make sure that we've got a remaining quorum of PSQL.
Yep, I've been monitoring it. I think we only lost 2, maybe 3 if you count Todd, and we were at all 19, so.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're still fine.
All right, great. So the next item on the agenda is regarding the SLA and their current alcoholic beverage to-go rules. I've circulated those to the committee so everyone can see those. I think the question before us, this is not an application. We haven't been asked to comment by anyone, but it was brought up at our last full board meeting by Senator Hoylman, and I think since then it's become official that he is going to be presenting legislation to this effect, that the alcohol to-go rules will be extended. I don't remember if there was any time frame that he wants them extended. Did anyone see that? But I think what we want to do here is decide whether we need to comment about beverage to-go rules now, how they're being implemented, how they're being enforced, and if they're working well enough to support or oppose legislation to continue them for either a fixed period of time or indefinitely. There's no real presentation on this, so let's just go to questions and comments from the committee on this topic. Matt?
I just had a question. I mean, I think generally this was positive, but I was curious if anyone knows why it extends for 2 years why it extends so long. Does anyone have an idea about that?
I think the point is just to make it easier for liquor licensed establishments to do business in the post-COVID environment. I think that was the intent. Certainly we have the opportunity to comment on that.
I mean, my sense was, or at least the thing that you had sent out, I thought had said after all of the sort of emergency rules were out of place. So I assumed that meant right now everybody is not, when things open up, people will be able to be at 25, 50%. During that time, it makes sense to do this. And I guess my question is just, how does everybody feel about once that ends for another 2 years, it continuing? Or is this something that is the goal for it to sort of this to be the new normal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'd like to hear from the committee about that.
Joseph? I think, Matt, I think that's a good point.
Jamie,
but I think
July,
once we,
July,
oh, sorry.
We had somebody raise their hand first. Joseph?
I'll be quick. Thanks. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to raise that question too. My initial thought here is, why wouldn't we allow this to become a new normal, maybe pending that it goes well? But I just can't anticipate why we would not allow that. But maybe there's an issue I'm missing, so I'd be interested in hearing anyone else who has thoughts about it. I wanted to raise another point that came up in the last committee's meeting, which was about the speaker was talking about a potential idea of opening plazas like maybe the Times Square pedestrian plaza to, you know, tables for people who are taking out food from to-go restaurants. So you can kind of have a gathering of people that are drawn to one spot. You know, I wonder if it would be a good idea to temporarily allow, you know, people there to drink in public. That might be outside of this legislation, but within these limited areas that are opened as, you know, outdoor eating areas, you know, I wonder if that would be helpful to businesses. I think if it was done carefully, it could be more profitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the concerns that we've had, and one of the reasons I circulated some of the articles that have been publicized about the issues, you know, and lack of enforcement. You know, the guidelines from the SLA say that you can only serve or deliver alcohol if it's with food. That's not happening. The SLA guidelines also say that any service has to be in compliance with the open container law, which, you know, does not allow people to mull around with open containers of alcohol, and yet that is still happening. So, you know, I think as a committee, we've got one, to think about whether the guidelines are appropriate and effective, and two, what we do about enforcement if that's not happening. Sarah, you had your hand up?
Yes, I had my hand up. Again, Senator Hoylman's proposed bill, summary of provisions. The bill would allow for 2 years after the expiration of the COVID-19 disaster emergency. Is that correct? Wouldn't it be, the bill would allow for 2 years after the implementation or the start or the beginning of the emergency? We're talking about 2 years, or do I have that totally wrong? Please enlighten me.
I think you're right, and I think that was Matt's point.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, I'm not against that at all necessarily. I just wanted to make sure I was understood. Like Sarah, I wanted to make sure I was understanding it. That's
how I read it.
I mean, to me, it's like there's a disaster emergency. For 2 years, we do this. That's what it seems like to me, but I could be wrong. Anyway, thanks for listening.
July?
Thank you. I was just going to say, to respond to Matt's point, that's a very good point. 2 years post the disaster declaration, that seems to be a long time. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. And I think the market force will direct people when it's safe to do so to remain at the establishments, which is the preferred way regardless. So.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Me, BJ.
BJ, I didn't see you raise your hand. But
thank you. No, I just raised it physically. So I have just two quick comments. Is what struck me when reading that letter and the bill was like the 2-year clause, yes, but the same token is like, what happens when there's, again, I come back to the small restaurants that cannot meet the criteria for, you know, having it enclosed cup with straw. So again, we're putting this burden on small business owners to have to comply in a certain way to operate their business, right? So the larger restaurants and establishments could probably maybe put out that initial funding or money to buy these cups and stuff that will meet this criteria. So as I referred to on Sunday, when I walked up 9th Avenue and walked up to Intrepid, there were many, many restaurants that were open. And then there were few more that were more popular because they meet that criteria. So it's like this cup with enclosed. So again, I come back to like, how are we, if we say we condone this kind of policy and law amongst New York City, how are we making sure that these small immigrant populations, small restaurants can comply with it? When they're already strapped for cash, they cannot meet the requirements with having like 6 feet apart. Now, in order to do this alcohol carryout, they have to have these cups that meet these criteria. So
that's a good question.
Thank you.
Did someone see the questions that Buzz posted in in the chat before he left. Here we go. So Buzz questioned, so the requirement that the SLA has that the alcohol to go is only permitted with food. So Buzz questioned, how you quantify that. He said that the bar that he went to allowed him to buy the alcoholic beverage for a group of 4 as long as they bought a 99-cent bag of chips. And it doesn't appear to me that there is any clarification about what it means to serve alcohol with food. Is that something that anyone wants to discuss? Anyone concerned about the definition of service with food?
Yeah, Nick, I would just say I'm not concerned with it at all. I feel like you're opening it up and it sort of is what it is. Either you're okay with the alcohol sales or you're not. And it almost doesn't even matter if there's food sold or not because people will find a way around it.
That's a good point. Buzz's second question was, how will the age of the person ordering beverages be verified? Delivery persons do not meet the customer and cannot verify age. Anyone have thoughts about that?
I believe in what I've read, the companies that do this type of delivery have to be licensed by the SLA. So presumably they're responsible. They've met some requirement to be responsible to check those IDs.
Yeah, I mean, I read that, in practice, if you have a driver so a restaurant is delivering their food to someone at home, the driver has to carry a copy of the liquor license in their car. It has to be in a closed container. I don't know what the requirement for checking ID is, but maybe that's something that we should raise as a question. Compliance with law.
Yeah, and along that note, Nick, I have to say that, Fresh Foods or Whole Foods, when they deliver beer, like I could put it in my cart and say, I want beer delivered. They don't check my ID, they deliver it, right? And I don't know if these guys have that special license in a vehicle and all that. So again, what are we saying that we're going to, in the spirit of wanting to open it up and the spirit of wanting to ensure that businesses open up, we're saying these are the guidelines and the criteria, and yet here's Amazon with Whole Foods delivering beer to my doorstep, and I don't have to sign for it.
Yeah.
They don't check my ID, right? And the beer is enclosed. So what is the difference? So are we having double standard again? So I think it's a precaution that I just want to raise. Like, I could have my nephew order beer, and they don't check it.
Sure.
I just want to flag that. Is that something that you experienced? Because I was under the impression that when you did order beer delivery, that they did have to check your ID.
No, I could actually tell them, like, if I'm not here, I could have my doorman or someone just say, oh yeah, this is for BJ Sung. And then I could put in a false date as long as I'm over 21. They don't check my ID.
So if it's given to your doorman, then your doorman would technically get in trouble for then that he or she would have to show ID. And then okay.
I've gotten, during my 11 weeks of being sequestered, Matt, I've gotten beer delivery from Whole Foods and through Amazon Fresh. They come and they'll say, ma'am, can you just put in your birthday? And I could put in everything, as long as I'm over 18 and 21. They never asked me whether I was 21 or 22.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that any legislation extending this should include some consideration about how legal age is verified. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the other thing that was raised, the 2-year duration, I I thought I heard sort of mixed feelings about that, that it sounds like it's too long, but not necessarily too long. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Is there anyone that thinks that 2 years is too long or not too long? Matt?
Sorry, I know I've been talking a lot, but I don't think that it's too long, as long as we are agreeing that this is something that should exist. I don't have a problem with it, but if it's going to, I don't actually know the reason why it's not legal to begin with, sort of conceptually, that a place that sells alcohol can't deliver it. That sounds like a rule without a reason, given that now there's a reason not to, and there's not a reason to argue against the rule. So I'm comfortable with it. I haven't heard an argument for why that rule existed in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken tonight, maybe Joe Mafia. Joe, would you like to say anything on this topic?
Sure. I don't see an issue with if you're selling alcohol, as long as there is some check on age. I don't think it's an issue.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I thought this would be a little bit more of a heated discussion. Are we all just burnt out from the first item, and now we're all just like, yeah, let's serve liquor, let's deliver it. 2 years, no big deal.
Yeah,
Is that what I'm hearing?
I just want to add to Matt's point. Please chime in, anyone, if there is a rhyme or reason for this, but it seems like there are these liquor stores in New York that offer free delivery all the time, right, of liquor. I don't really see a substantive reason for making it even longer than 2 years. So if you put something in there being like, hey, board is supportive of this being part of the business model, because who knows, COVID might spring back again, right? Like we don't know the future. And I don't see any risks involved other than what BJ mentioned, which is age, which I've seen. BJ, I've seen your issue too. When I order things from liquor stores, Whole Foods, whatever, they never check anything. I'm close to 30, guys, so don't worry. But like, but so I feel like, you know, if there's no rhyme or reason for this, why not just make this a thing, right?
Okay, I'm gonna call on 2 more committee members, and then I'm gonna open the floor to the public. Robert?
Robert Isaacs or another?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Robert Isaacs.
How you guys doing? I just want to say, I think the age thing is a question, and I think the enforcement is not clearly articulated, and I share some of the concerns that it's pretty easy to get around for anybody with the motivation and a little bit of smarts and maybe a willing doorman accomplice, or, but, on the other hand, we used to call it shoulder tapping when I was a kid. And stuff like that happens. So I don't want to get too hung up on it, given the current emergency. The thing I really find concerning is the sort of loitering element and the crowd control element. I haven't seen anybody with a real solution on that. And I do think we heard a little bit about this in open streets as well, but if it's just delivery and not the to-go element, I think it seems fine to me. There's just maybe some logistics and a little bit of record keeping on, you text me your ID, or, you email it into some address, or you upload it to some website or something, just so they have a little bit of backup or a little bit of documentation that they check that box. And what happens after that point is, I don't want to say not their responsibility, but to a certain extent, if people want to go to great lengths to deceive on age on alcohol, they will do so. And I have seen it and even done it in my time. So, it's a lot to ask, especially in the current environment, that every, one of these establishments be kind of hawkish on IDs and making sure it reaches the end user. So.
Got it. Okay. Todd, let's see if we can hear you. Todd, give it one more try. All right, we'll get back to Todd. Let me open the floor to the public. I see one hand, I see a few hands. Okay, Antonio, let's hear from you first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so having bartended in my prior careers, pretty much the onus is on the restaurant owner or the bartender when stuff is served. So they're responsible if they serve something. What I would say, going back to the prior meeting that you just had, there'll be some streets that are blocked off for restaurants to hopefully help them thrive and survive, and some streets maybe a block away that aren't, and they might only have like a curbside, takeout where you can do something. I think it's essential that we have this ability to be able to serve alcohol. I'm not saying loiter, but it also alleviates some of the stress on some of the streets that are blocked off, because not everybody will be on those streets that are blocked off. This will pull them away from that. So it'll be like a valve to kind of pull people away. So you will be able to social distance on further streets. So that's how I see that. But as far as why we don't allow this, many cities allow this, many states allow this. It's about time that we allow this practice here in New York State. We have some archaic rules here. I grew up in Manhattan. You can tap anybody to get alcohol. You could do it in the 70s, 80s, and now. So if you want to get something, you call your local guy and he'll just deliver it, and they look the other way. So that's my say on it.
Thank you, Antonia. Mario?
While we're waiting for Mario, I just wanted to say that if you're joining us from phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand.
Thanks, Luke.
I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes, Mario.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Again, this is a very touchy subject from our point of view. We believe that right now it is a good solution to help business recover and to help people manage to get some sort of relief from just being at home and being locked up and have a sense of some sort of normality out there, if we can call it like that. What we are concerned about is the enforcing of the rules and regulations, and we are not quite sure that whatever rules and regulations are now are strong enough to permit to have this kind of a business model to function without eliminating unruliness and a little bit of unorderly comportment like we're seeing these days in some pockets. We also are concerned that maybe this will become competitive against the liquor stores. And that's another kind of a thing that we have to be very careful. I don't think, or we don't think that just by extending it for another 2 years is going to solve much. Or you use this as an emergency moment or an emergency business model that we are applying now because of the coronavirus, or otherwise you turn completely, you do a 160 and you turn it into a full new law that permits something like this to happen and to really become an everyday kind of a business. But in that case, then they need much, much stronger regulations and ways to enforce those regulations. Because right now, I don't think that they work.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Would anyone else from the public like to comment on this matter? Okay, I will put the committee in business session. Todd, I still see your hand up. Are you able to speak, Todd?
I'm on a completely different computer now. Can anybody?
Yeah, that works much better.
Okay. So I just wanted to, the point I was trying to make was this is New York City, where rent control emergencies went on for 100 years, right? And although I think it's wise and important that we consider this as an emergency measure, it should only be as an emergency measure. And one of the things as a committee that we struggle with is we have the 2-year liquor licenses And when we get the occasional bad actor, we struggle with the idea that we can't really do anything to hold them to account other than to push the enforcement agencies to do things. So if, as Mario says, if we're going to recommend this or go on record as supporting this particular regulation, we got to put something in to say that we strongly recommend that there be some mechanism for expedited review of the occasional bad actor, either by the community board or the other point I was making even in the other session, I don't know if it got heard, was that we have to educate the various, we have to educate and make clear to the various establishments that during this emergency period, it's incumbent on them that they have the resources, whether it be a dedicated person on their staff or a website with an email address or something where they're going to be extra sensitive to the complaints that might filter back from their neighbors or from the community boards or from wherever. So I don't know if it's possible in an emergency situation, but certainly on our matrix or in the comments that we send along as part of our approval, we make clear that there's got to be some sort of expedited mechanism or sensitivity by the establishments to deal with the bad actors. And again, if it comes out that a particular establishment is giving out alcohol in their delivery process or out on the street, and it becomes to our attention through our office or through the neighborhood, then somebody's got to be able to step in and do something.
Great, thank you. All right, so I don't see any hands, so let me sort of summarize where I think we are. Based on what I'm hearing from the committee, we're in support of Hoylman's proposed legislation. We think 2 years is fine. Some people even think that there shouldn't be any time limit, that this should be a permanent change. The concerns are that we need to make sure that the existing laws and guidelines are enforced, including checking ID, enforcement, I see more enforcement, expedited review and dealing with bad actors, especially with this additional privilege. In return, we would want the SLA to expedite disciplinary proceedings in the event of bad actors. Does that summarize pretty much what the committee's feeling? Anyone have anything else to add about that? Simon?
Just a thought. I'm wondering, is it possible for these establishments to require that before anybody places an order that they show their face to the establishment and somebody goes in and the establishment looks them in the face and sees them for future reference? I mean, just kind of maybe even just that one extra step of having somebody say, hey, you know what, here I am, here's my driver's license, 21 or older, and you know what, put me down on a list, and just have somebody go that extra mile if they're going to have liquor delivered to them.
So your comment is about enforcement of the age requirement, and that the SLA should think of better ways, or operators should think of better ways to enforce that. I think that's your comment. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. I'll echo what other people have said. I mean, there's always a way around this, but if people are concerned about it, that's one thing that came to, that's one thing that came to mind. Ubiquitous use of social media, it could be used as a verification. I'm just brainstorming here, but
Yeah, that's my general input.
Okay. Any other comments? I'm feeling that we're coming to a conclusion on this. Sarah, what do you have to say?
Just to finalize my understanding of this, supposing the COVID emergency is declared over in May of 2021, this Hoylman law says that to help these businesses, they can have until May of 2023 to deliver alcohol to people. Do I have that right?
You know what, maybe that's a question we should ask. So maybe in the resolution, we should ask for further clarification of the timing proposal.
Well, I mean, if you like, we don't know when the emergency is going to be over. It could last a year, 6 months, 2 years. And it seems to me that the businesses need help, and it might help them to be allowed to deliver alcohol to be consumed off premises. So having that run 2 years after the COVID emergency is over, declared over, whenever that is, a year from now, 2 years, I don't know, that would help them. We want to help the businesses.
Does anyone have the legislation handy about this? This
well,
time?
I have it printed out in front of me.
Can you read for the committee what it says about the duration? Let's look at the exact language.
Okay, on page 1, second paragraph, this bill would allow for 2 years after the expiration of the COVID-19 state disaster emergency, any on-premises licenses and any manufacturing licenses with on-premises retail privileges to sell for off-premises consumption, any alcoholic beverages that it is licensed to sell for on-premises consumption.
Got it. So it seems to me that this duration is pegged to the state of emergency as opposed to the pause restrictions or any other timing. So the
well,
state of emergency.
Open. Yeah, we don't know how long it's going to be.
Well, the state of emergency ends when the governor says it ends.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we understand that, but based on the feedback we have from the committee, I don't feel that the committee really feels strongly about limiting the duration. I don't see a comment here about that.
Yeah, I just found it hard to understand. It's getting through to me a little
Sure.
bit at a time. Yeah.
Okay, so if I understand the committee properly, we feel that we support this. We want to see tightening of enforcement. We want to see some additional measures, and we want to see expedited review of bad actors. That the makings of a resolution. Is there anything else? Is there someone that?
Yep.
What?
This is DJ again. I just want to add to what Sarah said. I think it's important, but I think it has to be holistic, right? I think we heard that from the previous session that, whatever measures and resolutions that's, recommended and put forth, it has to be a holistic approach. So even if, let's say, we as a committee say, yeah, we're all for this, let's do this for 2 years and allow this, those who already have liquor licenses, what about those restaurants that were just cafe and now in order to expand their business, they need a liquor license? How are they going to apply for that? Do we have support system to support that, right? And then the third piece is, in terms of like going forward, if this is going to be a long-term thing, like how are we, again, going to be making sure that this is equitable for all restaurateurs, for all operators, right? Because again, hey, I own a taco place in Empanada. I want to offer margaritas and tequila, but I can't because I don't have that license. So how are we going to make sure that that support system is there, right? Because we know that liquor licensing is so tough. It takes many, many years. It's very cost prohibitive. So how do we ensure that if we're going to, again, say, offer this as an opportunity for all the characters, all the mass market in New York City, then how are we going to make sure that it is equitable again and diversity inclusive?
Got it. Okay, so we can add a whereas clause that, you know, we want to see we want to see the legislation, we want to see the SLA approach support small business and be equitable to both large and small businesses.
Yeah, and truly sensitive.
Got it. Okay, does someone want to make a motion to this effect?
Motion.
So moved.
Okay, so I guess there's a motion and a second, and we'll take this to a vote.
Nick,
Yes?
Craig, yes. Kelly. Is Kelly still on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Sarah,
Yes.
Joseph,
Yes.
Matt,
Yes.
Will,
Yes.
Rob,
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
Jamie,
Yes.
Joe,
Yes.
Mafia, sorry. Todd. Todd still on?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. BJ,
Yes.
Simon,
Yes.
Jessica. I think she might have dropped off. Okay. July,
Yes.
Mike.
Yes.
Okay. Motion passes.
Okay, meeting is adjourned, everyone. Thank you all for a really great discussion. It was probably one of the longest PSPO meetings we've had, but I think it was, yes, Vicky, please.
I wish I had everybody else that was at the previous meeting as well on screen, because I just want to say I'm getting emails and text messages from people saying, and I mean special people like heads of the bids and electeds that have watched tonight, and it's with tremendous amount of praise for Community Board 5 and how we operate, how the meeting was run, the kind of questions that were asked, the kind of insight that our board members gave. It's everything I always say about Community Board 5.
Thank you, Vicky.
Okay, thank you guys.
Nick, there are a few attendees who have their hands raised. I don't know if you want to.
I think the meeting's adjourned. If anyone, we've lost a quorum, there's nothing really we can do now. If anyone who's attending has additional comments, please send them to the board office. Luke, do you want to give the board office email address?
Yep, it's office@cb5.org. That's OFFICE@cb5.org.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good
Night.
night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.